There is one man in Jekyll and Hyde, and there is the machine his world made him build. The war between a good side and an evil side lives in the Adaptations, and only in the Adaptations. The duality reading is so embedded in the culture that the novel's title has become a common phrase, a synonym for two faces, two selves, the civilized person in public and the savage underneath. The reading implies a tragedy about human nature, the dark impulses that lie beneath respectable surfaces, the impossibility of fully suppressing what we contain. It's a universal warning and a forgiving one. We all have a Hyde. Robert Louis Stevenson published Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in 1886 as a study of the violence a specific moral system commits against the people it shapes, and of the particular monster that system manufactures when it requires virtue as the only permissible face. The two sides of human nature story came later, from the theater and the movies. The duality reading locates the problem inside Jekyll, in his nature, his choices, his personal failure. Stevenson located the problem in the system. Jekyll is culpable. The novel never lets him escape that. But he's also the product of a moral formation that demanded he be something no complete human being can actually be, and that gave everything it excluded nowhere to live. Hyde is the exhaust of that system. He is what falls out when virtue is the only allowed output, and everything else has to go somewhere. Let's set the stage. Richard Mansfield performed the stage adaptation in 1887, and his transformation scene, reportedly so convincing it generated letters to Scotland Yard claiming he was Jack the Ripper, established the theatrical convention. The transformation is a physical event happening to Jekyll against his will. This convention was in place, therefore, before the critical reading had time to establish itself. John Barrymore's 1920 silent film built the visual vocabulary. The grotesque physical changes, the dark face emerging in the mirror while Jekyll watches in horror. Spencer Tracy's 1941 performance made the Freudian framework explicit. Hyde as id, Jekyll as superego, the transformation as the return of the repressed. By mid-century, the adaptation tradition had given the novel a psychological vocabulary it did not have in 1886, and then used that to confirm the duality reading. What every version shares is the moment of loss of control. The mirror scene, the involuntary transformation, Jekyll watching himself become something that asserts itself against his resistance. This visual choice carries the reading's central claim. Something in Jekyll emerges against his will. Stevenson made the opposite choice. Jekyll drinks the potion deliberately. He drinks it the first time, the 5th time, and the 30th time. The novel is explicit, the arrangement is voluntary, and Jekyll sustains it across years as a practical decision. Channel memberships are open. Members get early access, exclusive essays, and a backlog of 100+ older videos. Jekyll is a wealthy, respected Victorian physician whose reputation requires public behavior consistent with his professional standing. He also has, as he tells us explicitly, a certain impatient gaiety of disposition that his public position cannot accommodate. The novel is deliberately vague on what this means, but the structural point does not depend on specifics. What Jekyll wants to do is incompatible with who Jekyll presents himself as being. Here is a systemic claim that the duality reading misses entirely. The incompatibility was manufactured by the position. Victorian professional respectability demanded more than discretion about your desires. It demanded that you be the kind of man who never had them. The professional face was the self, the whole self, and the only self the code would recognize. The impatient gaiety of disposition is the part of Jekyll the system could not represent and therefore forced him to deny. He spent decades presenting himself as a man who did not contain what he contained. The pressure of that presentation is what generates the experiment, and the experiment reveals a split the system had already made. The public Jekyll held all the moral assets, the conscience, the empathy, the relationships, and even the name. The private remainder held none of them, because the code had assigned every moral resource to the one face it approved of. What the potion actually does is more chilling than a split. It manufactures a separate physical form, younger, smaller, less marked by the decades of respectability that have shaped Jekyll's body, and above all, untraceable to the doctor. Hyde can do whatever Jekyll wants done. Jekyll wakes up the next morning in his own bed, in his own house, with his reputation intact, and no documentary connection between himself and anything Hyde has done. In the confession, Jekyll calls this the strange immunities of my position and exults over the mechanics. Think of it, I did not even exist. Those are the words of a man describing a benefit, and he managed it for years, scheduling his time as Hyde the way a professional man schedules his appointments, before the arrangement became unmanageable. Hyde operates on Jekyll's resources. Jekyll opens a bank account in Hyde's name, supplying his double signature by sloping his own handwriting backward. He leaves Hyde money in his will and furnishes him a separate house in Soho, so that Hyde's activities have no physical connection to Jekyll's respectable establishment. The alibi is maintained perfectly. When Hyde tramples a young girl in the street, money manages the consequence. The crowd that corners him extracts £100 for the family, part of it paid with a check drawn in the name of Henry Jekyll, the respectable name settling the bill for the monstrous act. When Hyde beats Sir Danver Carew to death in the street, nothing intervenes because the conscience lives in the respectable persona and empathy lives in the professional relationships that Hyde, by design, has no connection to. Hyde is built evil by architecture. Jekyll suppresses Hyde for months afterward, returns to his charities and dinner parties, and lets Hyde carry the legal exposure. The professional half maintains itself while the suppressed half absorbs the consequence. That's the arrangement, working exactly as designed. The systemic reading produces drama that is almost entirely internal and documentary. There is no monster scene in the honest version of the novel because Hyde is a mechanism. The horror lives in the structure. The bank account in Hyde's name, the practiced backward slope of Jekyll's handwriting, the Soho house, the will, the years of managed scheduling, and the financial settlement after the girl is trampled. Cinema has no native language for that kind of horror. It requires audience patience with administrative detail. A lawyer reviewing a will, a doctor practicing a second signature, a house in Soho furnished by someone who doesn't live there. The Freudian reading gives cinema the transformation sequence, an image kinetic and visceral enough to condense the entire argument into a single event. The systemic reading gives cinema a document trail and a conversation between a lawyer and a doctor. The voluntary nature of the arrangement creates a second problem. Cinema has strong conventions for depicting loss and temptation. The protagonist fights, yields, struggles, and is overwhelmed. These conventions are built for the duality reading. A protagonist who scheduled his Hyde time last Tuesday is a different kind of character, one where the horror accumulates through recognition. Every major adaptation has chosen spectacle, the only choice the duality reading leaves open. Subscribe to keep up with the series. This is 3 of 6 for my Gothic art. Utterson, Jekyll's lawyer and closest friend, conducts the investigation that occupies the novel's first 2/3, and he gets it wrong in a specific, instructive way. He decides Hyde must be blackmailing Jekyll. Notice what that hypothesis preserves. Jekyll stays a good man with one buried mistake, a victim being punished for some youthful indiscretion. Utterson operates inside the same code that built both their positions, and the code supplies him with categories for fallen men and preyed upon men. It carries no category at all for a gentleman who gamed the system on purpose, and so the evidence gets sorted into the nearest available shape. The facts stay visible the whole time, but Utterson is steered away from the one conclusion that would indict the system itself, that respectability can be pure presentation, and that the system can be exploited by exactly the people it was built to trust. The blackmail hypothesis is the system arriving at the conclusion it can survive. Jekyll's confession frames the entire arrangement as a tragedy of discovery, a scientist consumed by what he found. The confession is accurate about events and misleading about agency. It is the story the code taught him to tell, that the problem was always inside him, always personal, always the nature he was given, with the system he inhabited and exploited rendered irrelevant. Any moral code that demands a unified virtue face, one that requires its members to present themselves as people untouched by what every person contains, will produce the Jekyll condition. It will produce it most reliably in people who take the code most seriously. The truest believer builds his entire identity around the required face, and everything the face excludes is banished to a corner of his life where it accumulates without regulation. In systems thinking, there is a phrase, the point of a system is what it does. And so, the resulting deviance is the outcome of the system. The person who appears most thoroughly virtuous by the code standards is the person who is suppressed most completely, which means the largest Hyde, kept the furthest from conscience, empathy, or witness. The institutional virtue is, in the specific cases where it cracks, the precise mechanism that produces what it most abhors. We recognize this pattern because we keep encountering it. The figure of impeccable standing whose accumulation of protected deviance finally surfaces. The behavior is always read through Jekyll's frame, a personal failure, a character flaw, a dark side that finally overcame the good one. The systemic reading, that the code produces the conditions, is available and consistently not taken. And it's easy, right? We see people as enemies, and so therefore do not give them the benefit of the doubt. Stevenson's novel was published in 1886 and named the operation precisely. The system manufactures the monster, then supplies the account of the monster that keeps itself from being examined. That is an institutional problem, alive in every era. The last episode examined Dracula and the question of institutional frameworks. What happens when the structure trusted to manage threats cannot categorize what they're facing, and what the cost of the immune response is on the people it was supposed to protect? Jekyll and Hyde is the same diagnostic structure applied to the individual. What the code that builds the institution does to the person inside it, and how the code explains its own catastrophes to protect itself from examination. If you're interested in the Dracula video, it's linked here. Subscribe to keep up with the series. Next episode is on The Picture of Dorian Gray, and the mechanism Wilde built that every adaptation has gotten wrong. Thanks for watching, and stay copacetic.